Hello, welcome back as I continue to scribble a bunch of stuff on the screen and then talk about every card in the Slay the Spire compendium. Let's talk about Strike. This is Ironclad Strike specifically. This card starts out as 5 out of 10, well 11 cards for Ironclad, which means that on a typical Ironclad turn with the starter deck, you can expect to be dealing 12 to 18 damage or 18 to 27 if you've successfully applied Vulnerable. So that's pretty normal for Ironclad. It's also not enough to be beating Lagavulin or Gremlin Knob or Sentries without taking a ton of damage. And so despite having a deck which is composed of 6 offensive cards and only 4 defensive cards, you're still having to add more attacks to your Ironclad deck in order to get over that hump and fight Act 1 elites usually. So that's cool, but a result of that is that when you spend your early card picks on adding attacks to your deck, you end up having a deck that's even more weighted toward attack, has even less defense, and then it becomes very important to get rid of some of those attacks, add more defensive cards, and be ready for Act 2, which generally is going to mean removing strikes. So as you go through Act 1, you're both grabbing better attacks, stuff like Twin Strike is fine. Cards which deal a lot of damage for just one card draw are very good, so something like Carnage or Uppercut. Anger's super good as a card that adds to your ability to play a number of attacks in a turn, because if you only have 4 defends as non-attack cards, then you're often going to have 3 energy worth attacks in your hand, and Anger is another attack that you can play. We'll talk more in other cards about which cards are good to be adding to your deck in Act 1 to deal enough damage with Ironclad. Most of the attacks that you can be offered are going to be decent. They're all better than Strike, pretty much. But yeah, the general idea is you do actually want these strikes still probably to be like beating Gremlin Knob as effectively as possible in Act 1, but you also do need to get rid of some of these attacks so that your deck can be balanced differently, more appropriately going into perhaps the Act 1 boss fight if it's like Guardian, although Guardian's generally pretty easy to win. But more importantly, the Act 2 holy fights typically require that you have some block in your deck, and the Act 2 elite fights kill you pretty well if you're not able to block at all. Once you get up to 4 energy, you now have enough energy to be attacking for enough damage plus blocking in the same turn, and so you do need to be removing these strikes. And strikes are perfectly fine cards to remove because they're not very good cards. They scale very poorly. Something like Sword Boomerang is going to scale with strength far better than a strike does. They do very little damage per card, so if you think about how you only get to draw 5 cards every turn, drawing a Carnage or an Uppercut or basically any card other than a Strike that's an attack is going to deal you more damage per card than Strike does. They also deal bad damage per energy. You get 6 damage on this card for 1 energy, and the majority of attacks are going to do better than that. An attack like Clothesline doesn't, but at least Clothesline is a 2 energy card that deals 12 damage, so you do get it for only 1 card drawn, which makes it easier to fill out the deck with defensive cards and still draw enough energy worth of attacks to be attacking on the turns you need to attack. Anger is not better damage per card than Strike, but Anger, yeah, I think I already said that. Anyway, Strike is best when you have a little bit of strength and you have applied Vulnerable to an enemy. So I talked when I was talking about Bash about how it can be quite important to upgrade Bash if you're going to be dealing a lot of damage with attacks going through Act 1, and making it so your strikes are a bit better is one of the big reasons for that. If you're going to play in Act 1 where you're not removing 1 or 2 strikes, which is not that unusual, but I'd say that not removing 1 strike in Act 1 happens significantly less than half the time. You do have some potential payoffs. I actually didn't mention Pandora's Box here, but Pandora's Box will transform all of your strikes and defends, and so if you haven't removed any strikes yet, your Pandora's Box is even better than it would be otherwise because you're transforming 5 strikes instead of maybe 3. If you get the Act 2 Upgrade All Strikes Defends event, that can be a nice payoff. all of a sudden you get 5 upgraded strikes instead of 3. They're likely still the worst card in your deck. They're likely still the card that you want to be removing, but at least they're dealing more damage on the turns where you end up having to play them. And if you get the Act 2 Bites event, that can be a nice payoff too, because the Bites event will remove all of the strikes in your deck for you. So if you already remove 2 by yourself, you basically, you could have removed them all without paying that gold or using the event to get that removed. So generally, I have not found these payoffs to be enough to almost ever justify not removing strikes when there's a reasonable and practical time to remove a card. Almost never have I thought, oh, I'll remove a defend over a strike, because I'm likely to get upgrades on all of my strikes in Act 2. I mean, you're going to upgrade the defend as well, right? Or I'm going to get bites to remove all my strikes in Act 2. These events just don't get found that often. And Ironclad's fairly good at fights and benefits from apparitions probably the least of the 3 characters, and so I think that Ironclad should be prioritizing fights and elites in Act 2 a little bit more than the other characters, probably most of the time. But it's something to keep in mind if you do have your strikes still. You have to be careful not to remove your strikes too quickly. The cost for card removes starts to get up pretty high, and also the importance of being able to channel all of your energy into attacks is very high at the start of the run, but goes down later. If you think about the Gremlin Knob fight, but also in Act 2, like the Slavers fight, you need to be able to kill some very dangerous enemies very quickly early on in the run, whereas by the time you get to Act 3 and you're fighting against Act 3 elites and bosses, and Act 4 elite and Act 4 boss, the only fights which really require very rapidly dealing a lot of damage are Reptimancer and maybe the Act 4 elite, depending on how you're solving that fight. And that can often be solved by like having 1 or 2 cards like ML8 in your deck at that point in the game, depending on what relics you have and what support you have in other cards. So at that point in the game, you don't benefit from having the ability to draw 4 energy worth of damage cards every turn. Something like a Limit Break or a Demon Form is going to be far more important to draw to make sure that you can close out fights in a reasonable amount of time. You don't want to spend 4 energy on attacks every turn. You want to spend like 4 energy on deploying scaling stuff over the course of 3 turns while blocking with the rest of your energy. And then like 5 turns later, you can just like play a few attacks and win instantly. That's more the pattern of what you're looking for in late game fights usually. Not always, but often. And so, yeah, don't remove like 4 of these straight away. It's not necessary, and probably there's other stuff that you could be doing that's going to benefit you better. But it's not unreasonable to want to remove 3 or 4 strikes over the course of a run, I would say. And if you remove 5, that's perfectly fine too. Perfected Strike is fine, but I wouldn't say that it's like a payoff for keeping all of your strikes. I think Perfected Strike is better thought of as an okay attack to bridge the gap between early game and late game damage. But if you're relying on Perfected Strike as your late game damage, something pretty odd is happening. Like you have a Necronomicon maybe, or you have very good defensive relics, and so you have the ability to saturate your deck with attacks with the word strike on them. That does not come up very frequently in Ironclad runs, and is not a great reason to be holding onto your strikes. Cool. Hope you enjoyed the chat about strikes.